Hi guys, so today I will be discussing my capital budgeting scenario C results. In this scenario, I had a beginning APV of 286.72, and you can see from my current screen that my ending was 586.93 in 2014. Starting off with my revenue, my operating income, and my net income, you can see from the 2009 to the current that I had an increase, which is always a good thing, and my actual was higher than my forecast. So the majority of my projects did outdo their projections, which is always something that was nice to see. Going along with that, you can see the revenue by division. The retail was obviously the highest in the way of the revenue, giving back to my company overall. Moving on to the income statement and the balance sheet, you can see that my net sales increased steadily in the forecast, going from $335.20 to $536.79, and my net income overall will do the same, hopefully through the future projections, as long as my projects go to plan. And with the balance sheet, you can see that my assets and my liabilities increased steadily up until the 2024 end of projection date, with an ending total liability and stockholder equity of $428.49, which is always nice to see. Moving on to the historical financials, you can see that with the income statement, my net income does dip a little in 2010, but once I get the ball rolling after that first year of really investing a lot and not getting much return, you can see that it jumps 7 points in 2011 and steadily increases to its current state of 24.02. And within the balance sheet, you can see that as well reflected, how it increased steadily through the years as I invested and I could put more into the company throughout the simulation. And this is the big part. This is the most important. This is the one that was the most thought out. I did the most work on this, obviously, with looking into the NPV, IRR, PI, payback, the 1-year beta, and the 5-year beta. Those were my main factors that I looked at, with the NPV, IRR, PI, and the payback being the 4 that I focused on the most. Coming from this, I started with 5 projects in 2009, and I went all the way up to 27 in the end of 2013. Throughout this, it steadily increased in the number of projects that were available to me, and although I had so many options, I did end up doing 2 to 3 almost every single, except for 2013, which I did 4. In the beginning, my 2009, I was much more reserved and much more cautious in the ones that I decided to invest in. You can see that my options, or my choices, were Match My Doll clothing line, retail store expansion in the Northeast, and the New Doll film / DVD. You can see that most of these projects went generally very well. They didn't have much in the way of faltering. Whenever it came to the numbers, I sorted all of mine by payback period, although this was not my overall deciding factor. Due to this, my lowest payback period on this year, 2009, was the New Doll film with a payback period of 143. Going off of that, I went back to the net present value and saw that it had a net present value of 9.25, which is one of the highest in this year of selection. And the IRR and the PI were also the highest at 238.61% and 8.81, respectively. This was one that the 1-year beta showed a very high negative, which would impact my cash flow. It would show much more negative in the way of losses. But in the 5-year, it showed the highest in the way of returns, being 15.85, and that was the biggest indicator for me that I needed to try this one out and commit to that one, and it ended up exceeding sales and doing very well. The next one that I chose was the retail store expansion with the payback period of 5.33 years. It was the second on my list that I wanted to sort of commit to. It had one of the higher NPVs, and it had a mid-range PI and IRR. The NPV was 8.68, which was still on the high side, which led me to believe that it had more potential. The 1-year beta was also 0, which meant that I wouldn't take any loss in the first year, which was important due to the fact that it was my first year. And the 5-year was showing 3.82, which meant that I would get 2.82 back in the way of returns minus my costs. Going along with that, my IRR was 34.84, which was on the higher side of the middle range, and the PI of 6.43. These were all really good numbers, and it felt like a good option for the first year. The final decision I made was the Match My Doll clothing line. The NPV was one of the higher ones at 9.17, but the payback year was also the highest, one of the highest in this selection at 9.21 years. This was one that I debated back and forth upon, but with review of the other three aspects of the main four that I was looking at, the NPV, IRR, PI, and the payback, although it had a really high payback, I believed that it would have the most return, with the 5-year beta being 5.51, which was higher than the other ones in this selection. Moving on to 2010, I only made 2 decisions in this one. I believe that with my budget, I wanted to take on more expensive and riskier ones without doing so many. So in this, both of them still performed within where they were supposed to perform. Most of it with the tween book series was due to talk hosts, as you can see listed on my screen, that helped to boost the revenue. The accessory line just sort of helped with the cost. It sort of met expectations in that. With those two, in regards to their numbers, they were better in the way of the NPV, IRR, PI as the other ones, but they were higher on the payback years, which was something that I had to take into consideration, that I wouldn't see my money back fast on these investments. Going off of that, the toddler doll accessory line, it had the higher NPV of the two at 6.82. It did have the lower IRR and the lower PI, but I did like the NPV, even though the payback period was one of the longer ones in this selection. The tween book series was the NPV of 4.64, which was on the lower side, but in comparison to the IRR of and the PI of being 41.57% and 10.32, I believe that it was worth the risk with a low NPV. And both of these showed losses in the 1-year beta, but I believe that overall in the 5-year it was worth the shot to try to see if it would pay back in its respect to its growth. Moving on to the year 2011, my choices were growing immensely. I had 16 roughly choices at this point. I did still only go with 3, although I believed that they were good options. You can see that my acquisition was below investment. It did not do well. With that being said, I still believed that my numbers were good in the way that I looked at them. And looking through that, the NPV, IRR, PI, and the payback period, these were all pretty well in the range of their numbers and compared to each other, with the exception of the doll video game. It had the lowest NPV of 1.03, but it did have the lowest payback period of 2.42 years and one of the higher IRRs and PIs. It did take a negative 1-year beta, but it did have a positive 5-year, which was a major factor in my decision to go with it, even though the NPV was so low. The acquisition of electronic toy manufacturer was sort of a bust. It had really good numbers. It had an NPV of 37.88, an IRR of 14.85, and a lower PI of 0.56. That should have been my biggest indicator. However, I looked around it based off of the other numbers I was looking at. It also did have one of the highest payback periods of 9.37 years. I didn't take a loss with the beta, which was a positive for me in the 1 year, so I could give it a shot, and it did have a long-term success rate. My final decision, the Match My Doll clothing expansion, it did do well and outperformed all the projections that were put forth for it. It did have middle range in the way of the numbers with the 4 that I was looking at. It had a high NPV and IRR, and a high payback period, which wasn't that great, but it did have a lower PI. That being said, overall, this is probably one of my weakest years, simply because the acquisition sort of took me back a few pegs. Moving on to 2012, I did make 3 decisions in this one yet again. I just felt safe with a 3, I guess. I did have the most choices out of this one, but a lot of them were more expensive, and to do more than 2, I did have to choose a bit less expensive options. At this point, my payback periods were getting kind of high, and so I was looking more at the payback period to see my return faster as I was getting towards the end of this simulation. So most of my payback periods were decently low. They were all under 5 years, with the virtual doll community being the lowest at 2.06. That being said, it also had one of the higher IRRs and PIs. It did have the second most NPV out of the 3 that I chose, but it had a very good long-term standing from what I could see based off of the numbers. My other options that I chose were the Bookstore Cafe and Writers Club and the Toddler Music CD series. Both of those performed decently well. They did just as much as they were expected. The CD series performed twice as well as they were anticipating originally. And both of these had decently solid numbers whenever I looked at them. The payback period on the Bookstore was higher at 4.44 than the Toddlers Music series at 2.09, but they both had really solid numbers in the NPV, IRR, and the PI areas of the chart. Moving on to my last year, I did make 4 decisions with this one. I sort of went wild with the last one, trying to commit a lot in the investment decisions. And I believe that some of them were great decisions and some of them were not. The Dollhouse underperformed and the expansion were lower than expected. The other 2 performed slightly better or just at what they needed to be. With these, the payback periods were becoming much longer, and so I knew that I wouldn't really see my profits come back in the time that my simulation would be taking place. So whenever I looked at these, payback period wasn't as important to me because they were all decently high, with the exception of the Young Authors book series being at 2.17 years at the lowest. The rest of them were all decently high. With that being said, it was also the iffiest on the numbers for me. The NPVs were sort of all over the place. I had 2 that were in the ones, and then I had 1 in the middle range and 1 at the high range. For me, looking at them, it was based off of how my other projects were doing and how the other projects that were in the selection group were looking to be 1 year and 5 years out. That was a big indicator for me because a lot of them had very low 5-year betas and they costed a lot of money, and it didn't seem like it was worth it at the time. That being said, most of them performed pretty well. The ones that I was pretty sure of did not perform well, however. Whenever I take all of this into consideration and how I encountered the 27 different projects, I believe that the 4 main criteria, the NPV, IRR, PI, and the payback, were very important to how I made my decisions, although I did use the 1 year and the 5-year beta to help sort of check some off and select some over one another at the end. The first 4 were definitely the most significant in my decision-making process. And in the terms of cash flow statements, it was not so easy to tell based off of what I was currently doing, but at the end I can see that even though I sort of messed some things up and some of my decisions weren't as solid as my other ones, that the company will do well because I will end up seeing the return on the projects that had a longer payback period. So that was really nice to see that they would come back. As for regards to the income statement and the balance sheet, I do see that my gross profit and everything along those lines, they all increased. Finally, the capital budgeting rules really influenced my way of thinking because I did have to think in the realm of the future and how people budget. So whenever I think about budgeting, I think about it in an operations sense, and that was something that I really learned from the class and the lectures, is that although financing and the financing and the other aspects of this were important. Overall, the operating was the most important, and that was the one that I focused on the most, was getting the return back. Thank you guys so much for watching. And my ending APV again was 586.93. I believe that my projects performed decently well given my few mistakes along the way. And thank you so much.